Welcome to Speaking of Athletes. I'm Maddie Salamone. I'm a lawyer and athlete advocate. I was also a collegiate lacrosse player and chaired the Division I Student Athlete Advisory Committee to the NCAA, or National SAC, while I was in school. In this episode, we're going to cover the latest activity around classifying college athletes as employees of their institutions, starting with the memo put out by the National Labor Relations Board General Counsel Jennifer Abruzzo, and then we'll touch on a suit that has been brought under the Fair Labor Standards Act, as well as the latest move by the SEC and Ole Miss in allowing athletes to collect academic achievement awards of up to $5,980 per year. So let's start with the memo sent out by the NLRB General Counsel. Now, this is not legally binding in any way, but on September 29th, 2021, she sent out a memo to all field offices providing updated guidance regarding her position that certain, what she referred to as players at academic institutions, are employees under the National Labor Relations Act, and as such are afforded all statutory protections. Now, she was very careful not to use the term student athlete and pointed out what many advocates have been saying for years, which is that the term student athlete was created to deprive athletes of workplace protections. That's why I use the term college athlete, even though I, of course, used the term student athlete for years to refer to myself, including when I was advocating for athletes. But that changed as I learned the law and why that term was created in the first place. But she went on to allege that misclassifying such employees as mere student athletes and leading them to believe that they do not have statutory protections is a violation of Section 8A1 of the Act. What is the National Relations Act? Congress enacted it in 1935 to protect the rights of employees and employers, to encourage collective bargaining and to curtail certain private sector labor and management practices which can harm the general welfare of workers, businesses, and the U.S. economy. And this is according to their website. Now, the NLRA protects employees whether the workplace is unionized or non-unionized. What I do find interesting is that in all of this, the General Counsel only considers certain athletes employees. She specifically says that. She singles out scholarship football players at Northwestern and, quote, similarly situated players at academic institutions as employees under the Act. And, I personally think this is hugely problematic for a number of reasons. And it's extremely unclear at this point, but again, this is not legally binding, this memo. It is just interesting because it doesn't seem like it was extremely well thought out, and even recently when asked about the potential impact on other sports, she kind of indicated that she hopes it doesn't really impact other sports, but didn't really seem to go further than that. Now, as you might expect, a number of athletic directors through Lead One have since come out and said, as they do basically with everything that goes down, that if this were to happen, the other sports at their universities would be in jeopardy and likely be cut. Again, whether that will happen remains to be seen, but it's certainly an ongoing threat, I think, from universities anytime it comes to providing more benefits for players. So that's just important to make note of. Her memo goes on to state that under common law, an employee includes a person who performs services for another and is subject to the other's control or right of control. In addition, consideration, i.e. payment, is strongly indicative of employee status. That law fully supports a finding that scholarship football players at Division I, FBS, private colleges, and universities, and other similarly situated players at academic institutions, are employees under the NLRA. Indeed, players at academic institutions perform services for their colleges and the NCAA in return for compensation and subject to their control. And then she goes on to explain that the evidence presented by Northwestern football players supported, a finding that these individuals were employees because they showed basically that, athletes perform a service for the university, and that the NCAA generated millions in profits, and that it boosts schools' reputation and student applications, and that players receive compensation in the form of scholarships and other expenses. The NCAA controls the players' terms and conditions of employment, and the university controls the manner and means of the players' work on the field and various facets of players' daily lives to ensure compliance with the NCAA rules. Now, she goes on to allege that because of all of that, the players meet the definition of employee under Section 2.3 of the Act and also under common law of employee, and should therefore be protected by Section 7 of the NLRA. Also, I have to mention that the definition of employee in Section 2.3 is horrible. It literally starts by using the term in the definition, which honestly drives me crazy when I read definitions where you're using the word to define the word. But it says the term employee shall include any employee and shall not be limited to the employees of a particular employer. And goes on to say that unless otherwise stated, it can include individuals whose work has ceased as a result of a labor dispute or unfair labor practice. And then there are some more exceptions that really don't apply here. Section 7 is about the rights of employees, and it says employees shall have the right to self-organization, to form, join, or assist labor unions, to bargain collectively through representatives of their own choosing, and to engage in other concerted activities for the purpose of collective bargaining or other mutual aid or protection, and shall also have the right to refrain from any or all of such activities, except to the extent that such right may be affected by an agreement requiring membership in a labor organization as a condition of employment as authorized in Section 8A3. Now, unlike the court system, the NLRA does not require the party filing a charge to have actual standing in the case, meaning, someone any person can file a charge alleging that someone has engaged in an unfair labor practice, but it doesn't necessarily have to be an employee. And in this case, an athlete at a school. And basically, this is allowed because such a filing just gives the NLRB General Counsel notice that a possible violation of the NLRA may have occurred and should be investigated. And that matters because the General Counsel only has legal authority to investigate alleged NLRA violations after a charge has been filed. Even though the General Counsel may already be aware of such violations, as is obviously the case here because she wrote a memo. Now, right now, Michael Sue, co-founder of the recently formed college basketball player advocacy group, the College Basketball Players Association, or CBPA, has filed an unfair labor practice charge, which means that the General Counsel can potentially seek to have an administrative law judge determine that certain athletes must be classified as employees under the NLRA. Now, Sue is currently seeking athletes who are willing to participate and speak with the NLRB. Of course, many have been reluctant to do so out of fear of retaliation by their schools and coaches. And, I will say that I think it's a lot to ask of an individual athlete to stick their neck out. And I think that's a problem in a lot of these cases. And there have certainly been athletes in the past who have done so and really, taken one for the team, so to speak. But, personally, I would never pressure an athlete because I think that is a tremendous decision and, potentially really big sacrifice that should only be taken on voluntarily. And that goes for, I think, any of the movements and demonstrations that I think people have advocated for years, including, protesting a game or walking off the court, things like that I think in context, you're an athlete who maybe has 4 years of eligibility at an institution and, are potentially giving up what you've worked really hard to do. So that said, I will link to the site for the CBPA if you are an athlete or know athletes who may be interested. And, I've got to say, I am admittedly of a number of mindsets when it comes to players unionizing and being deemed employees. I think it starts to become a little more complicated when you start looking to deem athletes as full-time employees, including the issue of whether athletes would be then taxed on money they receive to cover their tuition, and things like that. I also think, and I've talked about this briefly before, but I think the idea of forming a players' union does become very complicated because even as chair of SAC, I will tell you that it is difficult to represent every single athlete within the NCAA because every sport is so different. And it's the reason why there are different committees that address different individual sport issues, and that even the NCAA does not try to individually make rules for every sport. And that even includes recruiting calendars, because it's just very different. And when you're talking about the needs of various athletes and what they're experiencing, those experiences can be vastly different when it comes to certain things. I think when you're talking about the dedication to your sport and how much time you're spending, I don't really think that necessarily dramatically changes, though there are sports that then there are a lot more obligations when it comes to press conferences at times and different things. But I would say by and large, the level of control that your coach exerts over you and the expectations placed on you are very, very similar, across sport. But I think that, again, to the issue of deeming athletes full-time employees, I'm mixed on it. I have to be honest. I think that there are some major reasons why that is appealing, and a lot of it has to do with, rights under workers' comp, because it is frankly outrageous that schools and the NCAA can get away with shirking financial obligations to athletes who suffer lifelong debilitating injuries while playing their sport and subsequently incur massive medical expenses, all the while they were just a piece of meat and, potentially brought in also a lot of money for their institution. But if this were any other kind of employment situation, their claims would be covered because they incurred them while on the job, essentially. And it is just wrong for any institution claiming to look out for the health and safety of players to deny such claims that directly relate to the health and safety of players. And maybe it should work the way that it does for graduate students and other students who work for the school and receive scholarships without being taxed on those scholarships. And of course, there are issues potentially with that model as well. But you do have, students who receive scholarships who also work for the school. And I think that may perhaps be a better starting point in some ways than immediately trying to jump to classifying athletes as full-time employees. And I will mention that it's interesting because back in March 2021, the NLRB actually withdrew a proposed rule that would have prevented graduate teaching and research assistants from attempting to unionize at private colleges and universities. And so you do have some issues there as well. And I can say that, knowing people personally who have are currently graduate assistants, and what I would characterize as immense responsibilities, considering that they are also, going through curriculum and trying to be full-time students, and then oftentimes working very crazy hours, and yes, being compensated for it in various ways, but I can see the impetus to want to also unionize for certain rights there as well. But it is interesting that the NLRB is wanting, seemingly considering, blocking that ability to unionize. And I think another important anecdote in all of this is the fact that in the concurring opinion in Alston, it was mentioned that in the event that players are actually able to collectively bargain, that might actually change the analysis. But the analysis under the current structure and the way that things work, obviously the NCAA was in violation of antitrust law. But again, certain factors and circumstances, including a potential antitrust exemption from Congress, would then change the analysis. So this would potentially have those implications as well, and it is worth mentioning. And especially to consider whether a move to kind of put more of the power and control in the hands of conferences may actually serve athletes better. And we're starting to see ways where that's kind of happening a bit. And we're going to talk about that, but we mentioned it at the top of the show, the move by the SEC to start allowing for these academic achievement awards. But, athletes could be students on scholarship who are deemed to be part-time employees of the athletic department, which again is something that other students at the school are able to do, along with receiving, I will say, perks of being an employee. And, I have to say that like some of the perks used to really bother me as an athlete, especially for students who worked within the athletic department, because they often included parking privileges that all of the athletes did not have. And there were a number of nights that we would come home really late from a trip, in the middle of the night, and have to walk around a really dark stadium, sometimes to the last lot in Blue Zone, which is what we called our parking lot where students parked, to get our cars and then drive home to catch some sleep before class the next day. Meanwhile, I was aware that some of the basketball managers could park, right outside of Cameron Indoor, and that was a place that we absolutely would have been ticketed for parking. And I could definitely tell some stories about being targeted as an athlete by some of the campus police, including one wonderful fellow who I kept seeing behind my car everywhere, even when I had a handicap pass to park different places because I had just undergone knee surgery. But anyway, I digress. Athletes were absolutely targeted for parking violations, and those were not fun tickets to have to pay, I've got to be honest. But anyway, the reason behind the movement for employment status of athletes is related to the denial of benefits by schools and the NCAA to athletes that would otherwise receive compensation under workman's comp for debilitating injuries and the kinds of injuries that employees might suffer, especially those employees who are engaged in dangerous activities, which look, the nature of sports is people get injured. It's well known. And especially in the sport of football, and especially in the rise of concussions, we know that people suffer lifelong debilitating injuries. And the issue with the term student athlete is largely the fact that the NCAA and schools have denied claims by athletes that would otherwise be covered under workman's comp. And one example of a case is one involving a TCU running back who was paralyzed during a game in 1974 against Alabama, who was ultimately denied workers' comp for the injuries he suffered. In fact, the school stopped covering his obviously massive medical expenses after his scholarship expired. And his final appeal was tossed out in 2000 after school officials testified that they had recruited him as a student, not to play football for them, which is absolutely ridiculous. So the term student athlete is really used to allow schools to kind of perpetuate this legal fiction that athletes are not recruited as athletes, but rather as students who happen to play a sport that makes the school a lot of money. And, obviously in the case of TCU, the football program and certainly the NCAA made more than enough money to cover those expenses. And the term student athlete was actually invented in the 1950s under the direction of NCAA President Walter Byers, who later kind of walked a lot of things back and regretted the way that he realizes that athletes were exploited. But it was invented when the widow of a football player who had died from a head injury received while playing football in Colorado for the Fort Lewis A&M Aggies filed for workman's comp death benefits. And obviously that term worked extremely well to enable the NCAA to get away with not compensating for those injuries. And it happens over and over and over again and repeatedly because of this term student athlete. Because, the schools are acting like, oh, well, they're students. They're brought here as students. They're not brought here as athletes. So we don't know them anything. The other thing that is going on right now is that there is a suit that just survived a motion to dismiss brought by the NCAA, and it could become a class action. But the amended complaint filed on September 23rd involves 14 current and former players, 7 of them men, 7 women, from Villanova, Fordham, Sacred Heart, Cornell, Lafayette, Duke, Notre Dame, Oregon, Arizona, Penn, Purdue, Tulane, Marist, and Drexel. And they are suing under the Fair Labor Standards Act, which is a federal law that guarantees minimum wage and overtime pay. Now, this is distinct from the NLRA and has different implications. And they also asserted state labor law claims for Pennsylvania, New York, and Connecticut at this point. And even though this case survived the initial motion to dismiss, it is still, it still has a long way to go. Because as a reminder, Alston took a decade to reach a conclusion at the Supreme Court. So we can expect a drawn out process here as well. And there are certainly going to be a lot of developments to see if this case continues or if it gets thrown out for other reasons, because basically the NCAA initially argued that athletes have no standing because they're not employees. So we'll see what happens. But interestingly, on the heels of all of this movement around athletes being deemed employees, both under the NLRA and the FLSA, we have the SEC now permitting schools to begin providing academic achievement awards of up to $5,980 to students. And this is something that was made possible because of Alston. And Ole Miss decided to be the first one to provide the $5,980. and it will be split into 2 payments in the fall and spring semesters to all of its academically eligible athletes. And it has apparently already given out checks. And, even though these awards, the academic achievement awards, are capped at that number currently, schools are also allowed to provide unlimited additional academically related expenses, which could include graduate scholarships, trips abroad, computers, etc. Again, all under Alston, though what really qualifies as an education-related expense very much remains to be defined. And we can expect other SEC schools to quickly follow suit. I think, again, Ole Miss really wanted to be the first because they came out and they were like, well, everybody else is going to do it, so we figured we'd basically be the first. And other Power 5 conferences, and including the ACC, which announced that it will give schools the option. And this is an important distinction to make here, because this is the benefit of having permissive legislation, which many advocates have been arguing for years is the best scenario, because schools are not required to provide benefits they can't afford to their athletes. But they can if they choose to, and can afford it. And obviously the SEC has no problem affording to do that. And it never fails to amaze me how quickly we start to see what schools are really capable of affording after they have, fought tooth and nail against certain athlete benefits, claiming that it will ruin college sports, or that they'll have to start cutting sports as a result. It's always amazing how quickly they suddenly find the money in their budget and enact the same programs that other schools have. Again, and I think this will be another one of those where schools will suddenly, rework their budgets and find a way to provide this, because it benefits them in recruiting. And that's what so much of this comes down to. But because of that, that's also a reason why I think having these rules, as I mentioned before, having the power more in the hands of conferences ultimately will serve to move things in a better direction for athletes, because they are the ones competing with each other. The conferences are always trying to compete. And again, that's where you had most of the rules at the national level, was schools who couldn't do something or didn't want to do something, creating rules that other schools couldn't, because they weren't willing to, create the same programs or do the same things. And they consistently argue that it was going to increase the gap between the haves and the have-nots. But, that's okay too. And I don't know why we've always been so concerned about trying to keep that gap so close at times, because despite all of the legislation, it never decreased the gap. Like, over time, those policies never serve to make some of those conferences, more competitive necessarily. And certainly, though, you see, especially during March Madness, you see Cinderella stories. It's not like those schools can never win. But in terms of competing for the best athletes, they're never going to get there. And creating rules that prevent the conferences that can't afford to from spending money on their athletes just harms the athletes. And I talked about in my previous episode what I think would be a potentially better model financially to actually enable some of the smaller schools to provide more benefits to athletes that would really benefit them. So I won't go into that in this one. But, I think that it's interesting, again, how many schools claim they're going to have to cut other sports. But consider for a moment that Ole Miss's head coach in his second year is set to make $4.5 million this year, plus bonuses and payouts. And the school will be spending $2.5 million on 415 athletes. So, in terms of looking for the money in the budget, a lot of times you can look for, well, how much are you paying your head coaches? And then how much money is being diverted into things that don't benefit athletes or that are really just wasteful or unnecessary. So, those are all questions that schools can ask themselves when they're looking at their budgets and trying to figure out how can we provide this benefit. Well, there are a lot of places that you can take money from. But anyway, there's still a long way to go with everything we've discussed on this podcast, and we will continue to cover the developments. But in the meantime, please feel free to rate this podcast if you feel inclined. And if you'd like to support the podcast, the link is in the show notes. Also, feel free to follow me on Twitter @MadSal15. And thanks for listening. And until next time.